and we're on Elephant in the Room again. I'm back with my good friend Bobby Cleveland. They're in Moore, Oklahoma, and we're going to talk about a big case today, Bob. Right there in your backyard, right there in hometown, Moore, Oklahoma. And we're joined by Kadie Smith. Kadie has, we've been in correspondence for about 2 years on a couple of other cases. And so when this case broke, we got together and we're talking about how we can get information and actually work on finding out how this case happened and what we can do to correct the problems in this case. And so, Kadie, would you just start by giving us a little background, how you know so much about DHS? And I know you have a little background.
I have a little comment to make first, JJ. I want to get something clear. He did not live in Moore. He's taught in Moore. Is that correct?
He also lived in Moore.
Oh, he lived in Moore. Excuse me.
These two men, and actually more police became involved in this. I'll tell you about that later on.
Okay. Well, that's all I got.
Yep.
Kadie, if you would just let us know your background and then just kind of tell a little bit, set this story up so that we'll be able to tell our listeners what it is that we're looking at today.
So my background, I am a degreed journalist, lots of twists and turns in the professional career, but let's just say there came a point when, God gave me the push and I ended up going to work for DHS and child welfare for some years and was sort of quickly pulled into a unit at the state office. So I have a really good understanding of the law and policy. There are thousands of pages of policy that people in DHS must follow. So that gives me sort of a background to understand where things went wrong. I also worked at the State Department of Education, was recruited over to work with families from the State Department of Education, and worked there for, so to combined about a decade in state agencies. And then you all know when things sort of started to go south where truth is concerned, when we got into COVID, I decided to go back to journalism and start telling some truth because our local legacy media outlets were not doing that. So that's sort of where that ties in. But this particular case really caught my attention. It started when a Moore Public Schools 6th grade teacher was arrested. He and his same-sex spouse, this would be the Harrisons, were on a spring break cruise in March of 2024, and they were taken off the cruise. He was arrested, Solan Harrison, the teacher, for the alleged molestation of a child on the cruise. Now, this was not a child related to them or adopted by them. This was a child who came on the cruise separately with his family from another state, not from Oklahoma. These men were flown back to the United States by federal authorities, and then Moore Public Schools was notified by the FBI. They made Mr. Harrison step down. He was suspended with pay for some months while the FBI finished their investigation, and then he was indicted in June of 2024 for a child sex crime. 9 days after his indictment, he committed suicide. And I first covered in an article that situation. And in that article, I revealed that these men had an adopted son. His name was Lincoln. He was very small. Of course, concerned about that child and that child's safety, I reached out to OKDHS, their child welfare services. I reached out specifically to Deborah Shropshire and their communications person, Deborah Martin, to ask if this boy, Lincoln, who his last name, adopted name was Harrison, was ever involved in DHS. Was he fostered through DHS? Was he adopted through DHS? And I got back a very short statement saying, basically, because of confidentiality restrictions that are supposed to protect the families and children, they could not confirm or deny that this child had ever been involved with DHS. So at that point, I did not know. I had no idea. That could have been a private adoption. That could have been a surrogacy. So I assumed, very much assumed, because they had all the case information, that if it went to the director of the Oklahoma Department of Human Services, that they would be looking into the safety of this child. Given the arrest and the allegations against one of the adopted fathers, that they would be checking in on this child. I should not have assumed that. It did not happen. Then a short time later, I came across a newspaper clipping from Kansas, from this tiny little newspaper called the Parsons Sun in Labette County, Kansas, which butts up against Oklahoma up in the Northeast, right? And it revealed that in April of 2010, before this man, Solan Harrison, had gone from Kansas to Texas to Oklahoma, that he was arrested in April of 2010. And I want to read you that clip. That clip says, Solan G. Harrison, 22 years old, of Dennis, is charged with 2 counts of aggravated indecent liberties with a child, 2 counts of criminal sodomy, 2 counts of indecent liberties with a child, and 2 counts of furnishing alcohol to a minor for illicit purposes. The clip says that he made his first appearance on the charges, and a hearing was set for April 26th, and his bond was reduced somehow from $100,000 to $25,000, and he was set free pending trial. Okay, so that's all that's out there. So I thought, holy smokes, this man had already been arrested, but he was able to come to Oklahoma quickly. He and his same-sex spouse become foster parents, then adoptive parents. He was able to get an emergency teaching certificate and then an alternate teaching certificate, and he was previously arrested. How does this happen? He spent 2 years with 6th graders at a Moore elementary school. So I started digging. I went to Kansas and I asked the sheriff there in Labette County. I put in a lawful open records request. They have very similar laws in Kansas to Oklahoma. It's called KORA, the Kansas Open Records Act. And immediately when I put in that request with the sheriff, the local newspaper pulled that clip out of their archives and hid it. So I know you all have had your experiences with rural corruption and cover-ups, but how do you contact a sheriff and then the local newspaper start covering up? I had already screenshotted the piece, so it was there, but they also hid the only other mention of this man in that paper, which was he and who is now his spouse were involved with a church youth group and were doing a Thanksgiving event for a church youth group, and they were mentioned in that. That was also pulled down. So we have all these layers of people giving sort of special treatment to this protected class to cover up child sex crimes, which I don't know, Representative Humphrey, if you've seen that before in Oklahoma, have you?
Actually, I've actually seen a case. One of the worst sex offenders that I ever dealt with. He molested a kid at 6 months old, a 6-month-old kid when he was 18. Moved to California and molested 6 or 7 kids, ages 7 to 8, both boys and girls. Wrote a 2-page article what he liked to do, what specifically in detail what he liked to do with both sexes. Would make you want to kill him. Came to Oklahoma. I got involved in this case. We caught him molesting another kid. He went 5 years in, 5 years out. Got out within a week. We had him at 4 different major locations, but one of them was at a church camp. I'm not going to name the church, but anyways, we caught him posing as a photographer. Had I don't know how many kids from across the state, other states, somewhere in the hundreds, that he had what he liked about the kids, shots of the kids, crotch shots of the kids, sicko stuff. The guy ended up running away from us, tried to break into Mexico, caught him on the border. We had a nationwide bulletin out for him, caught him on the border, and we ended up giving him, I think, 30 years federal time, 180 from Oklahoma City on another case we worked up there. And then the 5 years I had pending on him, we just left that open in case he ever gets out of 200 something years. And if he does, he's still got 5 years facing him. So Yeah, I've seen them cover that up. That church camp personally called me and said, "Can we keep this under wraps?" I said, "What is wrong with y'all?" No, you call every parent and make sure their kid has not been molested. I don't think that happened. But again, as you're talking, my question says, anybody went to the more, families and let them know that, hey, it sounds like, and and for our listeners, you need to understand, we're talking about sex offenders. There's situational. For instance, if a guy got married and had a stepdaughter, and every day that stepdaughter's coming through inappropriately dressed, and he doesn't say anything, and the next thing you know, it gets out of hand. You kind of call that a situational. Had that guy not been in a situation, he wasn't out there looking for kids. You have what you call a true pedophile. A true pedophile doesn't want anything but kids. That they don't want somebody older. They want kids. They want to molest kids. This guy sounds like an absolute pedophile. And when we say that, how are we basing that? Because you just described that he had a case there in Kansas. You described that there was another situation with the church camp, or with the church there involved in youth ministry. Then we see that it's likely that his partner, when you're looking at his partner, one could assume his partner is young and would likely be one of his victims. And then you see him catching another charge on this cruise line, which apparently, he committed suicide. It appears like that charge was going to stick. So
Yes.
when you look at that, you're looking at a pedophile. Now, here comes my questions. What is the requirements of DHS to look at the background? I mean, surely they do backgrounds on the adopted parents, correct?
Correct. So if you look at whether you're screening a teacher for a teacher certificate, whether you're screening foster or adoptive parents through the state to place or adopt a state custody child, they all do federal background checks, which include fingerprinting. The problem that we're running into now is we see within law enforcement, DAs, attorney generals, courts, state agencies, we see this putting sort of a progressive idealism over state law. So they are going to get these people through. So we see some of that going on. But if they're not prosecuting the prior crimes of these people, they're not showing up on the background checks. So more public schools did background checks on this person. He came up clean. He was not clean. Background checks are rendered useless in our society if every level at the courts, the DAs, the people who arrest, the prosecutors, if they're not doing their jobs, these things are not on the records. Background checks have become useless as a tool to keep kids safe. And just like you were saying, the system has lost its ability to go any further than these standard check the box sort of background checks. We've lost all of our instincts. Here we have a guy who has been seeking access to children in everything. In his out of profession time, he's going to work with this church youth group. In his profession time, now he's going to work with children. In his family time, now he's going to try to foster and adopt children. Pedophiles seek access to kids in everything they do. And it seems like the system is unable to recognize that as a red flag anymore. And if you bring up the red flag, when we get into this and we talk about what the DHS worker said, she was screaming from the rooftops with red flags and no one would listen to her. So the system no longer, if someone's of a certain lifestyle, someone's of a certain race, if this is the same sex couple, this political correctness is blocking people from saying this might not be a safe person to be around children.
Well, let me ask you this. Did you go back and look at why did Kansas drop the original charge? Is there any kind of indication? Could you find any kind of indication?
I don't know that they did, because I put in my open records request, like I told you, then everybody started covering up. They would not, unlawfully, they have withheld those records at the county level. This went back and forth. I actually pushed it to the Attorney General of Kansas, and they would not help. and they would not make the county level follow their own CORA law, their open records law.
See,
So
that's
we
now
do not
that's
know.
what's frustrating to me is because you have a reason that we have these open records. I've got a lawsuit filed right now in the state of Oklahoma over this very issue because they bury what they want and they come along. The AG will go, "Oh, we investigate that." Yeah, you didn't investigate. You didn't do one thing. You didn't talk to one victim. You didn't talk to one person. You didn't talk to the whistleblower. How can you even say? But then when they come out publicly and say, "Oh, the AG investigated it," and JJ just doesn't know what he's talking about, it makes everybody believe when in honesty and in reality, they didn't do one thing. They lied. They absolutely lied. So here we have a sex offender, possibly, again, it's kind of a catch-22 because if the guy didn't do it right there, you want to protect his rights. But at the same time, you would like to know, you should be able to go back and pull those court records. There should at least be a record of the guy was charged, it was dropped. You know what I'm saying? You ought to be able to go in the court system and find that. You ought to be able, they have a log that's supposed to be open record, that they have a log in the sheriff's office. And I used to do background checks before all this computer stuff. We going back a ways, okay? So used to, if they'd have called me up and said, "Let's do a background check on Bobby Cleveland," I bring Bobby in and I say, "Bob, where have you lived? What have you worked? What have you done?" And again, then I go back to the main areas. You know what I'm saying? If he's lived in Cleveland County, I go down to Cleveland County Sheriff's Office and go through that log. I figure about the time when he turned 18. So from whatever year that is, I just go forward just seeing if I see his name. And I go through there to see if I see his name, which is a lot of work. I mean, that's a lot of work, but that's the way we used to do it. It can be done, and especially if you know about the time of the arrest, makes it much easier to find. So they didn't even have those kind of records. Did you try any of that?
Oh, goodness, yes. So all of those arrest records, all of those essentially are online now. There's a few states where they're not, but those are online and they should be public records. And if they were sealed, there should be a note in there. You should be able to see the case number and it says that they were sealed. There's nothing on this man's arrest. So I cannot tell you if they failed to prosecute. I cannot tell you if they prosecuted and then it was expunged, which we're seeing. They used to never expunge child sex crimes because these people will then go seek a position and they'll pass a background check. I can't tell you which of those things is true, that he was either not prosecuted or he was prosecuted and it was covered up and expunged. I can tell you that I've reported on a case in Washington County here in Oklahoma where a same-sex couple, two men, were seeking to adopt a baby, and he had a sexual crime. And in Oklahoma, the only misdemeanor that will keep you from qualifying as a foster or adoptive parent is a misdemeanor that involves some kind of a sexualized crime, right? So he had that expunged by a judge, which he shouldn't be able to do up in Washington County, and they successfully adopted. I couldn't get to those records. They were expunged, closed. We don't know if those were related to a child. We don't know what they were, but this happens. So judges who are on the same ideological page as these folks have made them a protected class, and we can't see it. No, even the Attorney General of Kansas does not care that they're unlawfully holding these records.
Well, I've seen judges, and not so much on a social agenda, but they know the person. They just didn't believe the person did it. And so, again, give them a deferred on a felony sex crime, which is an ineligible sentence. You can't give a deferred on a sex crime. You can't expunge a case on a sex crime. But I've seen it done twice. Yep. I've seen a misdemeanor filed probably where it should have been a felony, reduced it down, and again, got the person off. and where they didn't have to register and stuff like that. So,
Oh, yes, all kinds of things that shouldn't happen are happening in our courts. Absolutely.
And I will tell you, Kansas generally is a little lesser than us in my experience on sex crimes, because they'll have like what we call a statutory rape, where we don't have that, where they'll allow and again, I don't, there's cases, you got to look at all the cases, you got to look at all the facts. There are cases where I don't disagree with that and say it's okay, but again, you would want to go for a period of time on supervision to make sure that that person is not reoffended. You want to have 5 years or so of supervision, 2 years, and say 3 years unsupervised, so that you can make sure. And if they had done that in this case, guess what? You would have had records there, so there's no adoption. You would have had charges there, so that if something like this happened,
there's no teaching certificate.
You would have no teacher certificate. So again, if they had just done an appropriate job, even fairness, I mean, we're talking a fair, giving the person a benefit of doubt or open, if they'd done anything like that, then we wouldn't be where we're at today. And I will tell you, that is amazing that you can't even get a record, and that they would go back and remove. What's even more disturbing is go back and remove those news articles. Now could you even speculate why they would do that? I mean, is this guy some bigwig in that town of Kansas?
I would say it looks like that's his county of origin. His family is there. They're involved in different efforts there, as far as there were some things about homeless. His family of origin also fostered and adopted. So I think that this family is well regarded in his county of origin. And, some of the worst corruption I see in Oklahoma is in rural counties. It only takes a handful of people to control everything, and they don't rat each other out. They cover up for each other. So I think there's some rural corruption. That would just be a speculation on my part. But one of the things that I'm probably most concerned about in this case is, you got to remember, I've written these 2 articles. This man was arrested on the cruise ship. Then I find that he was arrested prior in 2010, and I put out another article. I still don't know how they got this child, okay? After the second article, the child's biological parents reached out to the publication, and they were, in contrast to all of the government agencies, incredibly transparent about everything that transpired. They provided documents, they provided logins to medical records that I wasn't even asking for. These parents had been silenced and needed someone to help them find this child. So imagine that you have a baby out there that's taken unlawfully by DHS. And I say that, I'll explain why I believe that to be true here in a minute. And you are not even really told what kind of a family that child is with. You are railroaded. When you hear their story, you'll be shocked. And eventually this child is permanently removed. Your rights are permanently removed. They're terminated. And now you find out the men that they were with, one of them has been arrested for a child sex crime. They read both of these articles, find out he was arrested twice. They are absolutely panicked to find this child, to ensure his safety. They want their baby back. And I completely, I think we can all really relate to that. So when they reached out to me and they then confirmed, yes, it was DHS that had our child, then we both, myself as a journalist and the biological parents, began reaching out to the Oklahoma Abuse and Neglect Hotline, the Kansas Abuse and Neglect Hotline, and said, we got to find this kid. We got to make sure he's okay. They screened all of it out. They screened out all of our lawful reports that a child is at risk of harm. So the cover up here continues. The Oklahoma screened it out. And when I went back to them to say, why is it screened out? They said, oh, he left the state. And I said, well, of course, I know that. I gave you all that information that he left the state. And I asked if the information had been pushed to Kansas. Who's looking into this? Oh, yes, the information's been pushed to Kansas. This is now Kansas investigation. I call Kansas. They have no record that Oklahoma ever reached out. That was just an absolute untruth.
Can I ask you something right here?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that kid would be on Sooner Care. That kid would be on some kind of. Do they get any money for adoption? I mean, typically you're going to get some money, and it's going to be from the state. So the state ought to be able to pretty much state. You know what I'm saying? Finding this
Yes.
kid shouldn't be hard. All you got to do is look where they're picking up the check, where we sending the check to. You ought to be able to find the kid pretty easily. Am I wrong on that?
No, you're spot on. And in fact, I ended up pushing and getting a supervisor at the DHS child abuse hotline and talking to her about it. And I said, I have some target addresses, counties that he may be in. And she said, oh no, we know where he is, because Lincoln, the child, is still on Sooner Care, and Ryan Harrison, the remaining adoptive parent, is still getting monthly adoptive payments. So he will get monthly adoptive payments for that child until that child is the age of majority. And that child will be on Oklahoma health care no matter where they move in the United States. He's going to be on it. They know exactly where they are.
They know exactly that. So finding him is not going to be an issue. They're cashing those checks.
It's not the issue.
Okay.
And we may want to, if it's okay here in the background, can we go ahead and pull up the article just quickly so I can just show folks a couple of the lead image so they can get an idea of what we're talking about, who the people are? If you wouldn't mind just pulling that up.
It's up.
Oh, so can folks see that now, the lead image? I can't on the screen, but
I'm not seeing it either.
It's
I'm
up.
It's
It's
up.
up.
Okay.
it's up. Okay, so the lead image, I'm just going to trust that's up. That is the two gentlemen, the two adoptive fathers, and that is the child Lincoln. Around the time of his adoption. The man on the left is man number one, I'll call him, was the one who was arrested on the cruise ship and arrested in Kansas in 2010 for child sex crimes. Just so everyone can get an idea of who we're talking about. The man on the right is now believed to be in Kansas with the child, and neither child welfare organizations at the state level have been willing to investigate. We also know that two other boys were placed in the home as fosters through Oklahoma Department of Human Services. The couple lived in Moore, and there was a 5-year-old boy and a 7-year-old boy who were also placed in the home. We also have no information about if they were abused. We have no record that anyone has checked on them. DHS is not talking about that. So we actually have 3, all of them boys, that were in that home that we don't know are safe or not safe.
Now we have a new DHS director.
Yes, we do.
And
yes, his name
have
is
you
Jeffrey
contacted him?
Cartwell. Yes, I have contacted him last week, sent him everything on this in an email, and then just within the last 48 hours, reached out on X and messaged him to try and prompt some kind of a response as to what is DHS's plan for sort of fixing this mistake. And as we move here into the real story of the family, there's a lot to fix here. And I understand that director is really essentially brand new, was just confirmed by our legislature. But I think that's the perfect person that has to step up and say, we're going to investigate ourselves when things go wrong.
He's refused to do that so far. We've called. In fact, I was told the other day that he was at a pretty big meeting, and they had a lot of people who are pretty upset at the system, that are people who are pretty supportive of the things that I'm doing. And that he got up and said, well, J.J. Humphrey is a really good guy, concerned, wants to do good for the people of the state, but he just doesn't understand. Now, this is what I'd heard, but he doesn't understand how the system works. And I'm laughing because he hadn't been around the system very, very long. I've been in the system 35 years. You know what I'm saying? If you work for DOC, you worked around DHS. I've worked with DHS personally for 30 plus years, have a very, very good understanding how they work. And I understand right now just how they're hiding. This is what really burns me up. They're hiding behind something that we did for kids that is the right thing to do. Mm-hmm. We want to make sure that we protect the identity of kids. We protect the information of kids being raped, molested. We don't want that going out there to the public, that following them around for the rest of their life. I understand all that protection, but we now the DHS hides behind a cloak of anonymity. Everything is, oh well, we can't tell you that molester. Now, why would they protect the molester? Why would they protect any of this? And I can tell you why they protect it, because they screwed up royally. And in this case, it's obvious they screwed up royally. And guess who they're protecting? They're not worried about Lincoln. They're not protecting that kid. Who they're protecting is themselves. They're protecting them and covering the whole thing up. And that's what just really burns me, because the stuff we're talking about, this parent, this same-sex parent, this adoption is not confidential information. That should be information that can be obtained. His arrest record should be able to detain. They should have done a little better job. It sounds like if you can find it, obviously they didn't look too hard. Hey, let me ask you a question though. What was the crime? Do you know what the crime was on the cruise ship? And do you know the age of the child on the cruise ship?
So we do know that it was a child molestation charge, or for physically molesting this child. And we do know the federal indictment. There's not much there, but you can see the federal indictment. Someone before the suicide fought to make this case unsealed. So they must have had a lot. And it was a child under the age of 12, the charge.
Under the age of 12.
And it was a male child, really only listed as sort of a John Doe. And the family's not interested in talking. The family was actually from Arkansas, just went on a cruise. So if you think about that, this man is arrested and indicted for molesting a child that he could not have more contact with than a couple of days tops, right, on a cruise ship. But we're not worried about enough as an agency about the child that we placed and adopted with him 4 years ago.
Or the two
go check on him.
The other two you left, or the kids that was in his care at the school. Are we writing, should more school be contacting the parents that he had contact with? Now, let me tell you this. When I was an officer and I worked a lot of sex crimes, we were had to do every case, probation, sex crimes, all of it, if you're in the rule. And what they taught you was that usually by the time a person gets caught, they had committed around 300 acts. It's kind of like, think about this. Do you get caught on your first DUI, or have you driven several times and boom? Now, if you got caught on the first time, you're really unlucky. I'd say don't do that, or you're really drunk. You know what I'm saying? But for what you're saying is for him, and there's a pattern here of abuse under 12, male victim.
Yes.
And again, very quick, 2 days. We know that most likely they didn't have previous contact. It doesn't appear that we know. And so it appears like very quickly he courted this,
yes, a very quick grooming process. We don't know anything about how he got access to the child. We don't know anything more than what is said.
Did I hear you say it was forced?
No, I don't know that. The federal indictment is actually listed in the first article. So if you go to visit.com, that's V1SUT.com, you will, and you go into this article, Where is Lincoln? There are links to both of the previous articles. And the first one from back in 2024 shows the federal indictment of this man. So you can see what the charges are. But those indictments really don't lay out all of the circumstances. They just lay out the charges that behind the scenes they've proven. So we don't know everything about it. But I do want to, I want to move on and talk about, if it's okay with you gentlemen, this family, the biological family of Lincoln, and where this child came from. Because now that they've reached out to me after they learned about his suicide and arrest, we know a lot about what happened in this case that shouldn't have happened in this case.
Hey, I'm going to stop you right there. Hey, Virgil, if you have it taken that down, you can go ahead and take that down now. Thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you. So the biological parents of Lincoln, their names are Andrew and Gardena Lockman. They are a married couple that live in Oklahoma. They now have another son that they're caring for very successfully. He is a beautiful, healthy little boy who would be Lincoln's full biological younger sibling. At the time, she was very, very honest with me that they both struggled with addiction, and that when she found out that she was pregnant with Lincoln, she was incredibly concerned for his health and safety and wanted to stop using. And she said it was really, really hard. Like so many thousands of Oklahomans, methamphetamines just ran over this state. So we all know a lot about that kind of addiction. And she went and she sought proactively on her own treatment. She went to a doctor and said, what can I do? And they referred her to what's called the STAR clinic. The STAR clinic is Substance Abuse Treatment and Recovery Prenatal Clinic, and that's at OU Health Science Center. And it's funded in part through the Oklahoma Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services, which have had a lot of challenges lately. We won't go into that. But that program specifically is for women with a history of addiction, find themselves pregnant, they can go to the STAR clinic and they will help them. If they're actively using, they're going to help them get off drugs. If they just have a history of it, which makes them more high risk in their pregnancy, they're going to get all of the treatment from high risk doctors to assure that we have a healthy baby coming. And then they follow the family home. That's what this entire program's goal is, to keep families intact. They're supposed to work with OKDHS and their child welfare services to support the family in going home. Someone's coming, social workers, medical people, to check on them to make sure everything's A-okay. Gardenia Lockman, who was the biological mother, was very successful in that program. They helped her. Our tax dollars paid off in this great program. And she was clean. She was getting all the prenatal care that she needed. Unfortunately, in December of 2020, so I want you to remember, we're at the height of COVID madness in the hospital world. She called after her water broke and she went into labor. She called OU Medical and said, hey, I'm in labor. I need to come. I'm a STAR Clinic client. And they said, oh, we're just packed right now. You can't. Which the STAR Clinic was upset about later and said she should have come anyway, but it was after hours and they told her to go to a different hospital, go to your closest hospital to where you live. So they went to Norman Regional. And from there, instead of coordinating with those state services that were working at the STAR Clinic and going with the plan they had in place, DHS in Cleveland County stepped in and overreached and took this child. And they did not have grounds. So if you go to the article at v1sut.com, you will see Gardenia Lockman, who her name was Sarver at the time, gave me access. She gave me all of her logins for all of her medical records at Norman Regional. I didn't even ask. She wanted us to know the whole truth. We post her negative drug tests. She was negative for all substances, and she had been for months. She was proactively doing everything she needed to. They found out later, which DHS didn't tell them, DHS knew at the time when they removed the baby, there were no drugs involved. Mom was not using drugs. They knew it. They knew she was a STAR Clinic patient, and they took the baby anyway because Gardenia had been honest at her intake. She told them, yes, I used to use drugs, but I've been with the STAR Clinic and I'm clean and this is the plan. They used that against her to take this child away from her. So he's 13 hours old, and I even have in the records that I've put screenshotted straight into the article where she was honest with them about everything. And they did it anyway. So the hospital contacted DHS and she admits that in the past she used drugs, and they came and took this perfectly healthy child. The notes say this, all of the stats for this child, he was born on time. He was perfectly healthy. Parents are both in the room, mom and dad. They're having skin to skin contact. They're bonding. The baby's breastfeeding. All's well in the world. And then the government steps in. So they take this child and say it's because of drugs, but it's really not. And the next things that happen are really concerning. So the person that comes in and takes a child away in DHS is called Child Protective Services. That's a very different, that's like the investigator on the front end. Then the case is given to what's called a permanency worker. And that worker at DHS works with the family. And their goal by state law is to do everything in their power, first of all, to place that child with a family member in the meantime. And secondly, to reunify that child with their parents, help correct whatever the conditions were. Well, DHS did some hassling with them since they didn't have anything on drug abuse. There was no active drug abuse. They started hassling them about their housing, and that maybe that was the reason the child was taken. They had steady housing. They were in an apartment for 6 or 7 months, and they still did not return the child. So the child was taken and immediately placed with the gentleman you saw in the picture. Immediately from the hospital, went to Solan and Ryan Harrison. The permanency worker at the time who was assigned to the Lockmans allowed me to interview her. Because of their treatment of this case, because number one, she said from the beginning, why is this child in custody? And no one would answer her. She knew this child should not lawfully be in custody. And then secondly, she had massive concerns about the quality of care the child was receiving in the home of the Harrisons. He was not being fed appropriately. During a parental visit, they discovered a massive diaper rash that was not being treated. And she approached the Harrisons about it, and they said, no big deal. And she said, very big deal. You will take this child to a doctor today. You will get us a report from the doctor today. She said there was no nurturance observed in the home. She was extremely concerned about the child in the home. She brought it to her supervisors, and she said not her immediate supervisors, but someone above that was saying this child could not be removed from the home. So that's super concerning.
So let me ask you this. Based on your research, do you feel like that this child was targeted to absolutely be taken for no reason and placed in a same-sex, because that was the popular thing to do, or for whatever reason, a same-sex marriage so that they could have a child? I mean, is that what you felt like? That?
Well, I asked this worker after she told me her whole story, and she went through all of detailed what her concerns were and what the response of supervision was to those. I asked her and I said, would it be accurate to say that it was trendy to put kids in a same-sex home during that time at DHS? And she said yes. And then later in the interview, she told me, and there are quotes in here from her, she gave a huge interview. This was an exceptional person who was looking out for the family. She said, what were her words? I can probably tell you her exact words. She said that the way it went down is that the Harrisons wanted a baby. The department wanted him to have a baby. Everybody knew, and they were going to make it happen no matter what. So I can tell you there is a state law that mandates that DHS has to make every effort, not just at the beginning of the case, but all the way through the case, including when they're considering adoption, to place any child in state custody in a kinship placement. That means someone related to them, right? Recently, since this latest article published, the biological father's brother, who is from Texas, reached out and allowed me to interview himself and his wife, and they tried to get Lincoln. They tried to be permanent placement for Lincoln. They would have adopted Lincoln, and they were boxed out.
Had he had any problem? I mean, did he have a job? Was he pretty stable? Good.
Yes. Back in child welfare days, I would have described them as a dream placement. He owns his own business. They've been married forever. They have thriving children of their own in their home. They're directly related. They had the financial means. Yes, very stable home placement.
Well, and, here's where I'm at. When I was there, when I was working with DHS, and a lot of my probation people were the same crossover clients. You know what I'm saying? I've been to terminations where we were taking kids away from parents. I can tell you, when I was working, rarely termination was the last resort. And to get to termination, you really had to have many opportunities in which you had basically tried nothing. You had to be just a pretty neglectful parent to get terminated, terminate your rights. We had multiple hearings. Did they have multiple hearings? I mean, was there a hearing at all? I mean, how did they terminate their parental rights? And if they haven't been legally terminated, then why don't they just go find this person and go take their kid back?
So they have been legally terminated. Let me tell you a little bit about that. So the permanency worker named Zakitha Washington that I interviewed that left the agency, the profession, and the state over this case, that she was so upset. One of the things that she described to me that she said that was the most disturbing about this case is while she had the case for about 9 months, and she reports the biological parents came to every single visit, they were absolutely observably good caretakers. There were not concerns. The case was never adjudicated. And she said it was the courts that kept pushing the date for adjudication back. So let me describe to you a little bit about what that is. So there are lots of checks and balances in the law that are supposed to keep DHS from just reaching into somebody's family and unlawfully taking their children, right? And one of those is that the case has to be adjudicated. DHS doesn't get to take kids into custody directly. Law enforcement can, and you know about that. Law enforcement can put a kid into emergency custody when they're out on a call and something's very bad, right? And then it gets turned over to DHS, and DHS has to start the process to prove that the child has to stay in custody. But DHS can't do any of that. They have to go to a judge. They have to go to the DA. They have to get an emergency order to take the child into custody. And then after that, the clock starts a ticking. They have to prove that that child is in imminent threat of harm in their parents' care. They have to prove that through the DA, and they have to have an adjudication hearing where the parents can weigh in on this, where everyone can weigh in on, is this really necessary? It didn't happen. It's supposed to happen within 30 days. It didn't happen. There's a time warning at 90 days that said, look, folks, you shouldn't even have this kid if you can't prove this by 90 days. They never even had the hearing. 180 days comes. 180 days. And in the law, it says at 180 days, that child's no longer in state custody. If the government hasn't proven that this child needs to be in state custody, he's out. And so this worker was so upset. She'd never had a case where it wasn't adjudicated. And she was so upset about it. And she did the right thing. She notified the parents at another visitation with their child. And she said, look, I whipped out my laptop. I gave them the law. I put it in their hands. And I said, this kid technically still isn't in state custody anymore. So of course, those biological parents said, then we're not giving him back to the Harrisons after this visit. So there was a bit of a showdown with the Moore Police Department got involved because the Harrisons and the higher ups at DHS called the police. And there was this silent showdown behind the scenes where law enforcement got with the state level of DHS, and they somehow finagled another emergency order to keep this child. The quote from the worker was that it was shady as crap, is what she told me, end quote. So we have the situation where the rest of the checks and balances never kicked in. After adjudication, which is supposed to happen in the first month, then every 90 days, DHS has to go before the court with a permanency hearing and a full report. How's the child? What does it look like in the placement home? Is the child safe? None of that happened in this case.
Kadie, can I stop you right there?
You can.
I've never seen, I won't say this, I've never seen Bobby Cleveland so quiet in my entire life. You got him stunned over there. Bob, what do you think about what you're hearing right now? I mean,
I'm thinking, wow, I just can't believe it that something had. I just can't believe it. It's just hard to believe. It just seems like there's something missing here, and there's not.
Because there's not.
You checked it. You verified it. You went. You did everything you're supposed to do, and you did it. Looked like you sounded like you did it twice.
Well, here's something I want to say.
I just can't believe the DHS can do this.
we were on before, so me and Bob will get on a little early and we'll discuss stuff. We're always talking about stuff. So today, when we got on early before Kadie joined us, we were talking about, well, what about this? What about this? And you know, we both kind of know the case. We've looked at the case a little, and we were just discussing it. And everything that we had a question of, well, maybe they did this, or maybe this was, you've answered everything that we had questions about that we seemed. Wouldn't you say so, Bob? I mean, everything.
Yeah, I mean, our big question was, what were the parents? I mean, how did this all happen? How did it go down? And no, she answered everything pretty clear.
Well, what's unbelievable to me, this girl sought treatment herself, checked herself in to save the baby, make sure was not positive, was not. How the hell did the state get involved, period? Because that's a medical thing of her own choice. And again, if she made certain that baby was not in danger. She took the appropriate steps that we rarely ever see. And now we're going to turn around. I'm going to tell you, they kidnapped this baby just to give it to a couple of homosexuals because that's trendy. I like that word, trendy. So because it's trendy, that's what it sounds like to me. Clear and simple, cut to the chase. DHS is in the business of stealing kids and giving it to trendy, new, woke situations. And again, here's where I'm at, and I hope our new director gets this, hears this, do something. If you're going to be the guy that fixes it, then quit talking about it. Quit talking about bringing somebody else from another state to clean up your mess because you ain't got the guts to do it. Hire somebody right here that would have the guts. If you'd want, I'll come over and do it for you for free. I'll come fix your department for free if you want, because this is pretty plain and simple. When you see cases like this, when you mess up, fess up, own up, and fix it right now. Because this, and again, hey, there's no way to fix this. 10-1 says that kid, again, if he grew up without the nurturing of a mother and father, again, he's in a homosexual relationship, which would tend to leave you messed up on. In my opinion, I'll go clear out and say I disagree with that lifestyle, and I wouldn't want my kid. And I think you ought to have a choice as to where your kid ends up like that. Again, that's insane that we would even push that. And
why do you say that it's trendy? I mean, I don't understand why you say this is a trendy way to do it. Why?
Well, let me cover a couple of things that I think will speak to that. So obviously DHS knew where they were placing this child, but a disturbing part of this case is that they did not tell the biological parents anything about this placement. They did not know who had their child. They did not know, even in the generic, anything about them. Yes, it's a couple who's fostered for us before. They didn't know anything. And we know now from the permanency worker, it's because these two men said, we don't want them to know anything about us. So another thing you have to understand is state law mandates that foster and adoptive parents must support the state's goal, primary goal of reunifying kids with their biological parents. When you go through foster training, they tell you, you have to understand, you have this child temporarily, and you need to be part of the solution of helping this child get back home to the parents. Not only were they not willing to meet the biological parents, they were not willing to supervise court-ordered visitations. They would not let them come to their home. They instructed the permanency worker not even to tell them that they were two men, same-sex married. So this biological family for 6 months did not know that two men had their little boy. He was starting to developmentally.
Now, is that normal?
No. I mean, think about a parent's God-given right to raise their own children. Now you're saying they don't even have a right, even if there were safety issues that were legitimate, they don't have a right to even know a description of who has their children? No, you cannot do that. So Lincoln started to babble, according to his biological mother, and they went to every visit. They gave me about 100 photographs of all of their time with Lincoln that they cherished. The father said Tuesday at 10 o'clock was the best time. He still remembers back to 2021, that all of 2021 was Tuesday at 2 o'clock. He got to see and hold his baby. So the biological parents were doing all of those things correctly. And then at 6 months, Lincoln started to babble, you know, the mama, dad, all of that kind of thing. And biological mom told the permanency worker, hey, I really don't want, you know, things were going great with them. They want their baby back. I don't want Lincoln calling anybody mama. And that's when the permanency worker said, I can't keep this silence anymore, no matter who says. No one's going to be calling anybody mama because your child is with two men. And so the biological couple said, we're not okay with that. We're not okay with that. DHS is supposed to respect the religious and cultural beliefs and practices of a family, and they're supposed to make every effort to respect those with the placement of that child in a foster home. They objected. They objected on religious grounds, and they were ignored. The permanency
recent Supreme Court case, not on this particular issue, but it's talking about parents who are Christians did not want their kids getting books on LGBTQ. Took it all the way to Supreme Court. Supreme Court agreed with the parents.
Right. And so you get into the legal aspect of this. Number one, the parents, since the case was never adjudicated, they were never provided an attorney. They never had representation. Their child was permanently taken and they never had representation. And then secondly, there's a huge grounds on these religious sort of term and really being treated very differently than the foster parents for reasons of perhaps lifestyle. There's a huge discrimination case here, and these parents are lawyering up right now. So it would be,
to answer your question, the final analysis on my end is these kids were kidnapped.
Unfortunately, it looks like unaccountable agencies can legally kidnap someone's child. And if Oklahomans think this can't happen to them or somewhere within their extended family, you're kidding yourself. They're very powerful and they're very unaccountable. So it's a big deal. No representation for the parents, no adjudication. Why would you do that? I can tell you that in Cleveland County, where this juvenile deprived case took place, there's a man named Stephen Bonner, and he was the longtime judge down there for juvenile deprived. Yeah, known as a very fair judge. If the DHS is the problem, I'm calling him out. If parents are the problem, I'm calling him out. He was a huge child advocate. 3 weeks before Lincoln Lockman's birth, he stepped down and retired, and Associate District Judge Bethany Stanley, this is in District 21, Bethany Stanley was appointed to that seat, that bench, by Governor Stitt just before Lincoln Lockman was born. So she took over all of these juvenile deprived DHS cases right before he was born. So we may be seeing some very different decision making starting in November of 2020 in that court.
Did the child did Lincoln have an advocate, a guardian ad litem? Was there anybody there for him?
It's impossible for him to have any representation on the child's best interest because the case wasn't adjudicated.
So he had no lawyer and they had no lawyer.
Correct.
Well, ain't that interesting?
So we have this case after we have the showdown after 180 days where the parents say, we know the law now. He's not in your custody anymore. And then they get this sort of shady emergency order to, again, put him in emergency custody for the second time, not adjudicated, not an official ward of the state, right? So all of that happens. And of course, you have parents who had fought addiction in the past. And if you know anything about it, with the greatest stressors and grief upon them, and the system started fighting back when they started pressing the law. They gave them a new permanency worker, one that the old permanency worker, who was a great family advocate there for over 12 years. Now the new permanency worker is described as far more compliant about the decisions of the uppers at DHS. And they took the family from 1 2-hour visit a week with their child to a half-hour visit a week, they began boxing them out and fighting back against them for asserting their rights. And the mother described, I say, hopelessness, powerlessness, anxiety, grief taking over. Her quote was, "I feel like someone in DHS knew this couple and they were looking for a baby and the process was tearing us both apart." So they both admit openly that instead of being helped, this drove them back to addiction. And that's where things start to fall apart. And immediately the courts DHS asked to terminate their rights and threatened them that if they didn't relinquish their rights, they could never keep another child in Oklahoma, which I think is unconscionable. So here's someone who reached out for services ahead of time, was doing great with them. They were working. Our proof here is if you look now, where we're at now, this biological family has a home, steady employment. She's actually seeking a business certificate. They have extended family around them, and they're successfully raising a very healthy little boy, Lincoln's little brother. Now look at the family DHS chose. We have a second arrest and an indictment for child sexual abuse. We have one that has now taken the kid over state lines, and he's posting GoFundMes that say he needs money for mental health treatment because he's not doing well, financially or mentally. And we have a system that won't even check on this child that was housed with now a twice arrested, indicted child molester for 4 years. So when you look at the outcomes, how can we not say there was a huge misstep in the system, and how can we not correct it? And now they're screening out anyone who's concerned about this child.
So let me ask you this. How much support has the parents, the biological parents, gotten from the community or from anybody else? I mean, has anybody really stepped up and tried to help them? I know you have. I'm now going to get really vested in the case. I can tell you, after visiting with you this weekend, I was already kind of when me and you visited. So everybody knows we talked about 2 weeks ago probably on this case, and I was interested, vested, already kind of, okay, I'm going to help out. I'm going to do this. Asked her to come on, asked Kadie to come on to explain this to all of our listeners. Now, I'm going to ask you to do something. Share this video. Get this out. DHS. And again, here's what's funny, Bob. Do you remember me talking about a case in Tishomingo in Johnson County to where I wrote the DHS and I tried to call and I'm getting a runaround. And finally, I left a message on the workers, a pretty ugly message. I will say that you are kidnapping, and I'm going to try to file kidnapping charges on your sorry ASS, And so then I called and left a message like that on the supervisors, and their lawyer contacted me back and said I was threatening them. And I wrote her back and said, you darn skippy. I didn't quite put it that way. You darn skippy I am, and I mean every word that I'm saying. You're sorry, low-life kidnapping SOBs is kind of what I put on the response. And hey, I'd love to go to court and because I can verify that. I don't have to say I think. I'm telling you, case after case, like what we're talking about. But here's what's funny: the same thing that you're talking about. They go in, they find drugs on some people in the home. Not on these two parents. The two parents passed not one drug test, 2 drug tests, and they come in and take the child without any kind of hearing and threaten these couples. If you don't do what we say. Now, here's what's funny. I think that they have, I think they're contracted. I asked them this and they refused to answer me. Are y'all contracted to some group that you have to go through all these classes with and all that? Are you contracted? And I asked him, I said, I'd like to know, is the former director an owner of that group? Are they co-owners? Do they have any interest in that group? I want to know these. Guess what? No answer. Now, I'm not saying that is true. I'm saying it should have been an easy answer. Absolutely not. But
JJ, we went over our time.
Oh, wow. I'm sorry. Hey, this is pretty interesting. Thank you, Bob, very much for
Thank you.
Hey, guys, I'm going to ask you, share this video. Y'all share the video. Just get this out. The word needs to go out. Kadie, appreciate you very much. You have a blessed day.